Welcome back, 1570 AM WNST. My next guest is our very own Luke Jones. Luke, welcome in.
Hey, Dennis, how's it going, my friend?
It's going fantastic, my friend. Hopefully you had fun watching the Super Bowl between the Rams and the Bengals.
Yeah, I don't think there was a whole lot to complain about. It was a good game. As someone who grew up with this music, I enjoyed the halftime show. I know that was very much a generational thing, but I very much enjoyed it and had to laugh at seeing on Twitter that if you knew all the words to the halftime show, maybe it's time to start thinking about scheduling a colonoscopy or at least setting up a Roth IRA or so it was funny hearing that. It really makes you think how the years fly by, but bringing it back to the game, it was a good game. You can't ask for much more than it being decided in the final couple minutes. And we talked about this last week. On paper, the Rams were the better team, and I think as much as the Bengals have nothing to be ashamed about, the better team won. And I think if that happens and you get an entertaining game in the process, if you're someone that's just an objective observer, don't have any skin in the game, so to speak, then what more can you ask for? Is an entertaining game and pretty cool to see. We've talked about it with Eric Weddle, Matthew Stafford, someone who's been around forever. Was labeled a loser playing in Detroit for so many years, and probably a great reminder to us that even the biggest stars in the game, they can't do it all by themselves. And I think when you look at that, you look at someone like Aaron Donald, who, for my money, is already on the very short list of the greatest defensive players in NFL history. Cool to see those guys reach the pinnacle. And I think what's fun about this Super Bowl, and we talked about this some in the lead up to the game, there's not a whole lot of talk now that lingers as far as legacy and all of that. Matthew Stafford Hall of Fame talk, that bores me at this point. He's got a lot more to do if he's going to be a Hall of Famer. But I think, unlike the Patriots, Tom Brady talk, even getting into the Mahomes and Chiefs talk, where we're talking so much about legacy, this is kind of just, play the Super Bowl. It was fun. And now it's on to the off season and the 2022 season. So very much enjoyed the game. And now we dig into the off season and start looking towards the Ravens as far as what they need to do and who they need to get back healthy if they want to bounce back in 2022 and be back at that elite contender level.
This is good. You led me to a great segue here, Luke, because it's a long season for the players, for the coaches, for the staff, right? So it wasn't surprising to hear before the Super Bowl, Sean McVay, Aaron Donald talking about, perhaps retirement. And Calais Campbell was also in that conversation, but Calais has been resting and unfortunately versus playing playoff football. And he is indicating he wants to play at least another year. And when we talked pre-production here, you talked about the Ravens, the cap space, and all the players, the injured players coming back, and certainly, I guess, no better player to begin with than Calais Campbell.
Yeah, I think with Calais Campbell, the big question is going to be, how much is he going to cost? I think that's what's obvious. As much as we need to talk about this defensive line getting younger, and that doesn't change, you don't want to be in a position, if you can avoid it. Now, Calais Campbell might have two other suitors that he feels are better positioned to win a Super Bowl. If the Kansas City Chiefs come calling or Buffalo, just throw it out there. And it's all subjective.
Yeah, but not to cut you off, it reminded me of Ed Reed. Remember Ed Reed? He wanted to play with the Ravens, but the Texans came in at $5 million, and I think the Ravens were willing to pay him half that at that point. So that's my concern, like yours with Calais Campbell. Is there a team or two that'll ring the bell, relatively speaking, to get Campbell on their squad?
Right. It's the money and it's the factor. Hey, the Ravens have work to do. They can't just roll the ball out and say, okay, if we're healthy, we're fine. Do I think that puts them back in the playoffs? Sure. Do I think that puts them with Buffalo, Kansas City, the Rams, like the elite of the elites? I'm not so sure about that, Dennis, in the way that I would have been more bullish thinking that last year before that in the offseason. So, but the point is, it comes back to the money. He is going to be someone who's going to be 36 years old, entering year 15. That's a lot of wear and tear. And as much as he's been durable over the course of his career, he hasn't been quite as durable the last couple of years. Now, not that it's been a major issue. He had the calf issue 2 years ago. Missed a little bit of time this year. Only missed a couple games. But you have to weigh that, because I think as much as you want to get younger, As I wrote at BaltimorePositive.com, and I'm just using this as him being the example. It always sounds better in February and March to say, oh, we're going to get the next Calais Campbell, until that actually comes to fruition in the fall. And you realize that young guy that you drafted, who still might work out and still might be a really good player, he's not quite ready yet. And if you lean too much in that direction, that's where you might get yourself into some trouble. I think another factor that has not really been talked a whole lot, but where's Derek Wolfe in this process? Yeah. If Derek Wolfe is healthy and is more like the guy he was in 2020, where wasn't a Pro Bowl player, but played at a really high level, was an above average contributor for their defensive line, then I think you feel a little bit better about gearing or going much younger on the defensive line, with the assumption that, okay, Justin Madubuike needs to take another step. And Broderick Washington, who had a nice second season, looking like he could at least be a legitimate rotational player, does he take another half step, another step forward? If you get that and you feel good about where Derek Wolfe is with the hip surgery in the back, then you probably can take a little more of a firmer line with Calais Campbell or any veteran defensive lineman you could potentially bring in. So I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. By all accounts, he's enjoyed his time here. He said as much. I've heard as much. But what is the money going to look like? Keep in mind, this is a guy who's been, a very instrumental and active with the NFLPA. So not necessarily expecting the guy to play for free, and nor should he. And as I said, does there end up being another suitor or two that he might feel, they might be a little bit closer to a Super Bowl right now than I feel the Ravens are. And if he makes that choice, Ravens fans won't like it, but you have to respect it. So I think it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. But yeah, that defensive line, for me, it's going to be such a fine balance this offseason of needing to get younger. I mean, that's not negotiable. They have to get younger on the defensive line, but how much do you skew younger, knowing that could potentially lead to some growing pains in the short term that certainly you'd rather not have with a defense that, let's face it, had its issues last year and is going to be very much in a rebuild, reload kind of scenario under new coordinator Mike Macdonald.
Right. And of course, we had the late injury to Tyus Bowser as we talk about linebackers. Malik Harrison, shot in the leg. Then you have LJ Fort, who was also out for the season. So that as you go through the levels of the defense, there's certainly players to address at every level for this team.
Yeah, no question. I mean, they're kind of healthiest on the defensive line, and which is ironic because we started there, and you still had Derek Wolfe, and age is a big part of that. I mean, age has to be considered when you're talking about health or trying to anticipate the health of a position group. But linebacker's tricky. I mean, you mentioned LJ Ford; he's a free agent. Josh Bynes is going to be a free agent. Tyus Bowser, while he didn't go on IR, we know he tore his Achilles in the season finale. I know Eric DeCosta was very optimistic in what he said about him, but how can anyone really know at this point in time whether he's going to be ready for training camp, let alone talking about the start of the regular season? And more importantly than that, it's one thing to say you're ready to play. It's another thing to say what your performance level is going to be. I mean, that's what's going to be so tricky talking about all these different guys coming back. Not Lamar Jackson coming back from a bone bruise, or even Marlon Humphrey coming back from a torn pec. But when you're talking about, Achilles, ACL, those types of injuries where there's scar tissue, and there is a sense of getting back. Okay, you're ready to play again. Are you ready to thrive again? Are you ready to be the guy you were prior to the injury? So that's where I think it's going to be tricky for the Ravens at outside linebacker. And we've even found out, if you follow social media, which I know not everyone follows it breathlessly. I wish I didn't have to as much as I do. But Adafe Owe had a procedure on his shoulder, which, from what I understand, was something that goes back to even college. And look, I mean, that's not something that's atypical, not something that I necessarily expect is going to be a major issue for him. But if you're looking for him to take a major step forward and be the guy that reaches the ceiling that everyone's so excited about, then that's something to consider. So long story short, with Bowser, Owe to a much lesser degree, but we need to at least acknowledge that. Dalen Hayes, who barely played. I mean, I don't even know what you can expect out of him at this point, because he played 3 or 4 snaps the entire season. Pernell McPhee, either going to retire or presumably not back. I mean, who knows what happens with Justin Houston? He's another guy like Calais Campbell. I wouldn't be opposed to bringing him back if it's at the right price. But again, he's going to weigh his options financially. He's going to weigh his options in terms of other contenders potentially interested in him. And you just have to see what the market looks like. But, I that's where I look at outside linebacker and say, okay, I understand that they drafted Owe last year. I understand that they paid Tyus Bowser. I understand that they drafted Dalen Hayes in the 5th round. I still think that's a position that you look to anywhere from the first all the way through, your final pick of the draft, wherever it ends up being. If after you do some wheeling and dealing, you assume come draft weekend. I think outside linebacker and edge guys, and we've already mentioned defensive line, they're going to have to be in play. I think. Even just looking at it from a depth standpoint, Jalen Ferguson just hasn't done enough to really establish himself to say that he's definitely going to even be on the team. Talking about a guy going into the final year of his rookie contract and is making more money in that final year of the rookie contract. So I think that's a position group that, again, if you look at it from a best case scenario, Tyus Bowser comes back and is healthy. Owe takes a major step forward and is blossoming into, let's say, at least a guy that's in the Pro Bowl conversation. Dalen Hayes comes back and can be a rotational guy for you, and go down the list. And, you mentioned Malik Harrison, a guy who I think his future could be more as training as a Sam linebacker and maybe being an outside linebacker, because, the inside just hasn't really gone well for him. And maybe that's where he's best equipped to be. But it's a lot of ifs I just mentioned. So again, you kind of look at this, and even though the linebacker beyond Bowser isn't dealing with any other major injuries coming back from, you're going to be counting on some guys who don't have a lot of experience, and it's tough to really know what to expect there. So again, like the defensive line, you want to get younger. You'd like to add another edge guy that whether it's a first round pick or whether it's someone in the first 3 or 4 rounds of the draft. But at the same time, if you have a Justin Houston type guy out there that is available at a reasonable price and can provide some a known commodity for you and some leadership there, then I think that's something the Ravens will have to consider as well.
And then, Luke, we have the secondary, where we have names such as Peters, Young, Elliott, Humphrey. It's just Jimmy Smith. The list just goes on and on. It's just an unbelievable season that they had, and the situation that they're in right now.
Yeah, I think we start with Marcus Peters. John Harbaugh and Eric DeCosta have both said they expect him back. Not that I ever thought, he'll definitely be a cap casualty, but he's making $10 million. He's coming off of an ACL injury. He's going to be 29 years old. And I think it's also fair to note he wasn't quite as good in 2020 as he had been in 2019. Wasn't bad, let's be clear, but wasn't quite as good. So all those factors, you have to at least ask the question. So I think for me, the bigger question now is, do you leave that contract alone? Do you try to work out a short-term extension? I'm a little more leery about that. I feel the Ravens, they've been burned here recently of extending some guys either coming off injury or, in the case of Ronnie Stanley, just having horrendous luck right after a contract extension's given. So, I think in an ideal world, you'd like to not touch that Peters contract at least until you get into the season. And hey, if he looks great through October, remember they worked out a contract extension with him before the 2019 season ended. So, it wouldn't be out of the question to play it that way. But some of the other guys you mentioned, a couple of them are not under contract. Jimmy Smith, I think Jimmy Smith's going to retire, or he's just not going to have interest. He's already said he's not going to play for anyone else. I think if you're the Ravens, you tried to play this game in 2021 and it didn't work out very well. I think it was a case where probably in hindsight, and again, you're guessing, you're always trying to project, but there's still so much unknown. Probably a case of after 2020 should have walked away at that point, but he still played well in 2020. So I don't expect him to be back. I'd be pretty surprised if he is. Deshaun Elliott, he's a free agent. Look, when he's been on the field and healthy, I've liked what I've seen. But he hasn't been on the field and healthy more than one season out of his first 4. So how does that translate in terms of what he's expecting contractually, what kind of market is out there for him potentially. And then for the Ravens, even if that aligns, even if you say he's willing to take less money and maybe has some more incentives, or maybe you backload the contract, whatever you try to do to structurally, can you count on that? Because you still need the guy out there playing for you. And that's where, again, you kind of look at safety. And I know, people will talk about, I know I've seen Ravens Twitter already tweeting at Tyrann Mathieu, for example. And, and look, I'm not going to say that they shouldn't look at not necessarily him, but just some veteran options at safety if someone makes sense at the right price. But, I just don't know if you can count on Deshaun Elliott bringing him back and just saying, yeah, he's going to be your starting safety next to Chuck Clark again. So, you mentioned Tavon Young. Hey, good for Tavon making it through a whole season. I was happy for him with everything he's gone through, because he's gotten a lot of grief from fans. And it's like, look, he had a neck issue. He's had ACLs. I mean, these aren't hamstrings and groin pulls and, guys overweight and out of shape and things of that nature. Sometimes guys just, they don't hold up physically. So, you look at his base salary, I think it's $5.8 million. Am I comfortable with that? It's tough. I think ideally you'd like to, if you're going to hold on to him, you'd like to rework the deal, give yourself a little bit of protection, give him some incentives and say, hey, if you can stay on the field again and perform at a certain level, we'll let you make more money than that. Add some incentives in there that you can pay him more than that. Because if he's playing at the top of his game, then that salary isn't outrageous. So, but it's going to come down to Marcus Peters, and I expect Marlon Humphrey to be fine from the pec injury coming back from that. But let's call a spade a spade. They need Marlon Humphrey to play better than he did this past year. This was not his best season. Now, he wasn't awful, but was he the same top 3, top 5 kind of corner we've seen him be at his best? No. And I'd say he wasn't really even that close to that, save for a couple games or over the course of the season. He was much more inconsistent. So, as much as we focused on the D line and the offensive line, right? I mean, those have been the two big position groups, and you can throw edge rusher into the D line if you want to. We've talked so much about those two position groups, really since before the season ended. Everything I just laid out there, Dennis, is why I still wouldn't rule out. And I think 2017 is a perfect example of that. If the Ravens feel that a potential elite corner falls to them in the middle of the first round, history would say, don't bet against them necessarily taking that guy, because we know how important they are. Where Marcus Peters is at, or where he is at this point in his career contractually, and where he is age-wise and injury-wise. Tavon Young, we know the history there. So what are you really counting on right now? You have Marlon Humphrey. Okay, great. That's 1 out of 3 spots. And we know that third corner spot is a starter spot now. So as much as I know a lot of people would bristle at that, I'm not saying it would be my absolute top way to proceed. Would not at all be stunned if the Ravens end up taking a corner in the first round, just because of everything we laid out. But this also explains why you have to stick to best player available. And let's face it, the Ravens have enough position groups. They have a few where you'd say, okay, feel good about where they are there. But there aren't too many of those, and that's where more than ever you should stick to best player available. And as you know, Dennis, this will be adjusted, and you will react and kind of change your thinking depending on what happens with who they re-sign in terms of their own free agents and who they sign in free agency. It's best player available that fits a need. I mean, that's how it's going to fit. That's how it's going to work out most of the time, if you understand how you do this. And, not that they're perfect, but philosophically, I think the Ravens have a pretty good grasp of how the draft works. I think, there's 25 years worth of research that would support that.
Now, Luke, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm thinking this is Eric DeCosta's 4th season as general manager, right? Because the way I track it is with Lamar, he was actually taken by Ozzie when Ozzie right. Last year. So this is his 4th year. And a week ago, our good friend Pete DeLutis challenged Eric DeCosta's drafting record. Again, although Ozzie's in the building, Eric is still the GM, right? And he's learning. The Earl Thomas trade was horrible, and they moved away from that, so he learned from that. He alluded, I believe, that Yannick Ngakoue wasn't a good fit for the team, so he's learning. But now, whether he's looking for more durable players and not players that are injury prone, he's got a really big job ahead of him this season. not just with the free agent class incoming and outgoing, but also with the draft. That's how he sets his board.
No question about it. It's interesting. One of my friends on Facebook, just a WNST listener, longtime reader at BaltimorePositive.com, made a comment the other day that feels that this really, and look, there's always some hyperbole. The most important offseason is always the current one, right?
Absolutely, sure.
But when you really look at where they are right now from a cap standpoint, where they are with Lamar, some of the big deals that they've given out, where they're going right now, considering they do have the 14th overall pick, which is a spot they haven't been in very much. I mean, let's face it. I mean, this was only the second losing season of the John Harbaugh era, but I think there is a lot of pressure for this offseason to be a good one because, and I mentioned it to you a little bit earlier in our conversation, post 2018, let me rephrase it. Post 2019 and post 2020, I was very bullish about the Ravens being right there. Feeling that, wow, they're right there to win a Super Bowl. I'm not so sure they are right now, Dennis. And that's not to say they can't be come September, but I just look at so much of this. I mean, going back to the injuries for a moment, Dennis, if you look at, they have 10 guys that I kind of labeled it as notable players coming off of injury. Tyus Bowser, Nick Boyle, J.K. Dobbins, Gus Edwards, Marlon Humphrey, Lamar Jackson, Jawan James, Marcus Peters, Ronnie Stanley, Derek Wolfe. And those are all guys under contract, not talking about guys that are hitting the market in the next few weeks. That accounts for $99.72 million in cap dollars for 2022. Now, that's not cash, but that's cap space. That's 48% of your salary cap for 2022. So you need those guys, as many of those guys, to come back, and not just come back, but be who they were prior to injury. You need to be aggressive, be smart, but be aggressive if the right move is there to make in free agency, whether that's an O lineman, whether that is bringing in, you forget about Calais Campbell, but you bring in some other established defensive lineman to come in that's younger and be able to stop the run, rush, get after the passer. And I don't know who that exact guy is right now, Dennis. I don't know if that guy's going to be available a month from now. You have to hit on your draft picks. I mean, because so much of this is going to hinge on, okay, what happens with Lamar and his contract situation this year? Do they work it out between now and the start of the season? Does this go into next offseason? Are we talking about the salary or not the salary cap, the franchise tag with him? Is it a Dak Prescott kind of scenario? I don't know. I mean, there are so many moving parts here. And to be very clear, I'm not at all suggesting that they're doomed, but if this offseason doesn't go as well as it needs to go, I feel you could be in that territory that they found themselves in post Super Bowl 47, where it's good enough to be in contention and in the mix and can still make the playoffs and all that. And look, you have someone like Lamar Jackson, you're always going to have a chance. However, are they going to be positioned that they can really take that next step? And that's where things become more difficult now, because you're not talking about a star quarterback who's only making $2 million. I mean, they're not, that's not them anymore. So I think this is a really, really important offseason. And, I think as much as I think the Rams are still more of an aberration because you look at how incredibly healthy they were able to stay the last few years, I do think there are some lessons to take from Les Snead in the sense if you're the Ravens, hey, there's a guy that you love in the draft, or even if it's a guy that is on another team right now that becomes available that you just see in every way is perfect, don't be afraid to take a risk because, hey, at some point in time, and look, going back to what you just said, they've taken risks with trading for Marcus Peters and Yannick Ngakoue. Ngakoue didn't work out very well. Peters did. You're going to win some, you're going to lose some. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, but you do at times got to kind of figure out when you need to be bold, when you need to be a little more conservative, all of that. But I think this is a really important offseason in terms of what the post-rookie contract Lamar Jackson era is going to look like. Is it going to be a case of they're right there fighting with Kansas City and Buffalo and, maybe the Bengals, although we know being the loser in the Super Bowl, it's really tough to get back the following year. The Patriots are the only team that's done it in the 21st century after losing a Super Bowl to get back and win it, 2017, 2018. But hey, those guys and Justin Herbert, I mean, go down the list of the elite quarterbacks in the league. There's going to be a lot of competition in the AFC. So you want to make every move you make, you want it to be something that works out, that helps you, that's not going to be a misstep. And you're not going to bat 1,000, but you certainly want to be closer to batting 1,000 than, some of the unfortunate, some of the things even completely out of their control, things that have played out over the last couple of years for them. And unfortunately, as much as you can talk about the training staff and, trying to revamp the strength and conditioning program and all that, and look, they should look at all those things. Right now, those 10 names that I just mentioned, they need those guys to come back and be the same player. I mean, the worst thing that can happen is Ronnie Stanley's ankle still isn't right. And now we're not just talking about, an albatross of a contract that you're dealing with for the next couple of years. You also don't have your franchise left tackle. That's why I've said to you, that's why I'm looking at offensive tackle in this draft. You want to try to find an Orlando Brown type guy, a guy that you think is going to be your right tackle moving forward, but a guy that can easily move over to the left side if Ronnie Stanley isn't right. And, I think at this point, almost a year and a half since the injury we're talking about, still a lot of unknown there. And I'm not blaming the Ravens for that, but you do have to prepare for the possibility that he's not going to get back to the player he was. And that's a sobering thought, but you got to plan for it, I think, at least.
Well, also the Bengals have raised the competitive level in the division. They've raised the bar in the division, and Pittsburgh, look, they may get Jameis Winston, but they also may get Russell Wilson. So that changes the dynamic of the division as well. So a lot of things can happen, Luke, between now and then.
No question. And even the Browns, I mean,
talented, very talented.
I mean, they're talented, and they still have some cap maneuverability. I mean, look, are you going to get the Baker Mayfield of this year or the Baker Mayfield of 2020, who look, I'm not going to say he was MVP of the league or anything, but the Browns got as far in the playoffs as the Ravens did in 2020. So, this is not going to be an easy division. That's for sure. And, as we kind of said, the Bengals with Joe Burrow and look, the cap dollars that they still have to spend. I mean, clearly they're like the Ravens. They need to beef up that offensive line. There's no question about that, but it's not going to be, it's not going to be easy. That's for sure. And to your point, boy, if Pittsburgh finds a quarterback, or whether they draft one or whether they draft the right guy, even though this quarterback class, I think it depends what flavor of ice cream you like, so to speak. I think there's some guys that are intriguing, but no slam dunks. Certainly, but when they're going to be picking, that's for sure. But if they figure that out, if they get a franchise quarterback, then boy, game on in this division then between the Cincinnati and the Ravens and Pittsburgh. But hey, they still have to do that. That's easier said than done. And that's where the Bengals and the Ravens can take a little bit of solace right now, where they say, hey, as much as we just went over all the Ravens' issues, even with all the injuries they had, even with everything that went wrong last year, they were still 8-9 and still had a chance in week 18 to make the playoffs. Doesn't mean you should be complacent, but goes back to what I said at the start of the offseason, reacting without overreacting. And that's the balance that this organization is trying to strike right now.
Very well put, Luke. We'll cover so we cover the defense, all three levels. We'll cover the offense next week, as we mentioned, J.K. Dobbins and Ronnie Stanley and Gus Edwards, and the list just goes on and on and on. With that, please tell us all the great things you do for WNST, Baltimore Positive, and your social media presence.
Absolutely. I encourage everyone to follow us on Twitter at WNST. You can follow me personally at Baltimore Luke. Check out my blog sponsored by Coons Baltimore Forward at BaltimorePositive.com. Latest 12 Ravens thoughts, looking at, as I mentioned, those 10 notable Ravens players, not the entire list, but the 10 most notable. I left out some guys like Tyree Phillips and Dalen Hayes and Justice Hill, but looking at guys that I view as either being starters or major contributors, but looking at where they are right now physically, the latest update, what their cap number is for 2022, the ideal scenario, the less than ideal scenario. We'll be looking at that at BaltimorePositive.com. You want to be on the WNST Baltimore Positive text service sponsored by Coons Baltimore Ford. If there happens to be a Ravens notable roster move, whether it's a cap casualty, whether it is a meaningful contract extension, if they re-sign a Bradley Bozeman or a Patrick Ricard, any significant local sports news sent directly to your mobile device via the WNST Baltimore Positive Text Service, sponsored by Coons Baltimore Ford. And of course, anything throughout the week on AM 1570 with Nestor, including all of his Radio Row coverage from Los Angeles, any upcoming Ravens press conferences, although none to my knowledge are on the docket, at least for the next week or two. You can check out all of that at baltimorepositive.com.
As always, my friend, I appreciate your time, your wisdom, and your insights. Stay well. Looking forward to covering the offense next week.
Sounds good, Dennis. Be well. First weekend without football, it's an adjustment, but hey, I guess what? Watch some WWE Elimination Chamber. How about that, Dennis?
Hey, sounds like a plan to me. Thanks again, Luke.
Be well, Dennis.
You too. There he goes, Luke Jones here, 1570 AM WNST. We'll take a quick break and come back right after this.